Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Life Stream for History by podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Dennis MacDonald, and today we're going to be discussing why Dennis believes that Luke's Gospel knew the Gospel of Matthew. In prior episodes, Dennis and I went through his theory about the Q plus Papias hypothesis. We're going to explore his theory a bit further in his belief that Luke's Gospel knew the Gospel of Matthew, because a lot of scholars believe that Luke and Matthew were ignorant of one another, and they both copied Mark and the Q document independently of one another. And so, welcome back to the podcast, Dennis.
Thank you, Jacob. Um, how are we going to use the PowerPoint presentation? Is it going to be, can we refer to it as we talk, or will it just be posted later?
I think we could refer to it as we talk. I'll pull it up now, and you can just tell me when you think I should go to the next slide.
Okay, great. So this is the title slide. So we can go to the next one. This is the two-document hypothesis. It's the one that is usually used for establishing the existence of Q. And I'm sorry that Q is off-center there. The argument is that Luke did not know Matthew, and therefore the extensive Matthew-Luke overlaps against Mark must have come from a lost document, or likely came from a lost document. The argument for the two-document hypothesis, then, is the two documents are Mark, that influences both Matthew and Luke, and the Q document. Let's go to the next slide. The Farr and Goodacre hypothesis agree that Mark is the earliest of the Gospels and informed Matthew and Luke, but that Luke knew Matthew. Therefore, the Luke-Matthew overlaps against Mark can be, don't need Q, because Luke knows Matthew. So there you have Q up there with the double strike through, indicating that it does not exist, or the way Goodacre phrases it, it might have existed, but there's no way scientifically to reconstruct it. So let's go to the next slide. This is the Q plus Papias hypothesis, and obviously it is more complex. So I need to walk you through it. Let's begin with the Gospel of Mark. Mark influenced Matthew and Luke independently. Both the two-document hypothesis and the Farr hypothesis agree with that. It agrees with the Farr hypothesis that Matthew knew Luke. But it inserts Papias of Hierapolis, who wrote earlier than Luke or John, and refers to the Gospel of Mark and two Gospels of Matthew that were translations of an original Hebrew Matthew. Now, he was wrong about that, but he was right that the two Gospels are Matthew and what we call Q, or most likely the Logoi of Jesus as its original title. So when Luke talks about many having undertaken to rewrite the story of Jesus, he's talking about the Logoi of Jesus, Mark, Matthew, and Papias. But I failed to mention earlier that I also disagree with the two-document hypothesis in asserting that Mark knew Q as well as Luke knowing Matthew. So to summarize a very complex problem, in fact, we call it the synoptic problem, the two-document hypothesis asserts, as I do, the existence of Q. But in my view, the International Q Project that was located originally right here in Claremont, California, where I live, made two really outstanding flaws in judgment in their methodology. The first was to say that Luke did not know Matthew. And the second was to say that Mark did not know Q. And in my view, the most important part of the synoptic problem is the relationship of Mark to Q. So that is something that they intentionally avoided. Today, we're going to talk about the arguments that Luke knew Matthew. But my view, obviously, is that even though Luke knew Matthew, Luke also knew the Q document. And by the way, if one goes back 100 years to the origin of the Q hypothesis and the two-document hypothesis, scholars held that Luke knew Mark, Matthew, and Papias, and Q. They did not think Luke knew Papias. That's a new twist. But they did not think it impossible for Luke to know Matthew and Q. But of course, it made the recovery of Q more difficult. So in my book, Two Shipwrecked Gospels, and more recently in the book called Synopses of Epic Tragedy and the Gospels, I attempt to defend the Q plus Papias hypothesis, and to add, which many of your viewers will know, discussions of the influence of classical Greek poetry, especially the Homeric epics, on Mark and Luke Acts. So that's why, Jacob, you could turn the PowerPoint off now if you wanted to. But that's why this discussion is so important. So we'll talk about. Jacob, you talk more. Tell me how you respond and
Sure.
how you can clarify that.
When you look at Matthew and Luke, what do you see? And we've entered a different phase of the slide now. We're seeing textual comparisons here.
Right.
What do you see when you look at Matthew and Luke that convinces you that Luke knew Matthew?
Well, actually, there are so many things that we could talk about that we can't talk about in the space we have. So I've selected just a few. Usually in the past, the argument has been made, and I think it has been made solidly, that Luke has parallels to Matthew at places where Matthew already had changed Mark. So we call these minor agreements. So that is, Luke and Matthew agree in very small ways against the Gospel of Mark. And that is most likely because Luke has conflated his readings by occasionally using readings from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, some of those arguments have been addressed, and somewhat successfully, by saying it could be in terms of the differences or agreements could be explained in terms of textual transmission, but not all of them can be. The others that I want to talk about have been discussed by others, especially the far people. And so that's what we have here. For example, in the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke, we have a number of very strong parallels. So if I read the parallels on the left, I'll ask you to read the ones on the right.
Sure.
The ones on the left, in some cases, I attribute to the logoi of Jesus that Matthew uses. But in each case, you have that. I'll be reading from the left column where you have Matthew parallels. John came neither eating nor drinking, and you say he has a demon.
Wine and strong drink he should not drink.
For the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit.
And he will be filled with a Holy Spirit right from his mother's womb.
This is the one about whom it has been written, Look, I am sending my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way in front of you.
And he will turn many of the sons of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of fathers toward their children, and the disobedient to the prudence of the righteous.
As it was written through Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his footpaths.
To prepare for the Lord a people adequately equipped.
Now, some of those parallels do not come from the infancy narrative. In fact, only one of those does. But they do appear in Matthew, and they appear in Logoi. Let's take a look at the next slide. So what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it has been written, Look, I'm sending my messenger before you, who will prepare your way in front of you.
And you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways.
And all the region of the Jordan went out to him and were baptized by him in the Jordan River, confessing their sins.
To give the knowledge of salvation to his people for the forgiveness of their sins.
The people who sit in darkness have seen a great light. For those who sit in the region and shadow of death, a light has risen.
Through the bowels of the mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will look upon us, to shine on those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace.
By the way, that one's very important because it clearly is a Matthean allusion introduced by the formula, as it was said, or as it has been written. And now we have it appearing in Luke's infancy narrative. John the Baptist was in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance, as it was written through Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one crying in the wilderness.
And the child grew, became strong in spirit, and was in the wilderness until the day of his presentation to Israel.
Let's take a look at the next slide. These are parallels that appear in the Passion narrative, both in Matthew and Luke. A famous one is, I'll wait for your slide.
We're already to the next slide now.
Oh, no. Okay, so we have some more. That's beautiful. Okay. Yeah. After his mother had been engaged to Joseph before they came together, she was found to be pregnant by a Holy Spirit.
6 months later, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city in Galilee, Nazareth by name, to a virgin engaged to a man named Joseph from the house of David. The name of the virgin was Mary.
An angel of the Lord appeared to him, that is Joseph, in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David.
And when he had come into her home, he said, Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you.
Then he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and inquire precisely about the child, and when you have learned more, report to me so that I may come and worship him.
Let's travel to Bethlehem and see this thing that the Lord revealed to us has taken place.
And after arriving at the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, knelt and worshipped him, opened their treasures, and offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
And they went quickly and discovered Mary and Joseph, and the infant lying in a feeding trough. And when they saw him, they recognized the statement that had been told them about this child.
And because they had been warned by a dream not to return to Herod, they returned to their region by another route.
And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for everything that they had heard and seen.
Jacob, of course, there are very important differences also between the infancy narratives in Luke and Matthew. But this is a remarkable number of parallels that really cry out for a literary connection. All the more so because the Lucan infancy narrative also seems to have been informed by the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite when she announces to Anchises that the result of their sex is going to be a son, and you will name him Aeneas, and so on. He will have an empire without end. So the fact that you have that mimesis of a Homeric hymn and these parallels in Matthew, I think, is pretty striking evidence that Luke knows the Matthew infancy narrative and wants to expand it to include John the Baptist and to improve on Matthew's infancy narrative. Yeah, so this is the parallels in the Lucan Passion narratives. Mark already, of course, has Jesus being beaten before his crucifixion, but Matthew adds to it the question by the soldiers, okay, prophesy, who is it who struck you? And you have the same wording in the Gospel of Luke. So this is not a minor agreement between Luke and Matthew. It's a major one. And scholars have struggled to explain how it is that you could have that similarity. And the answer often is related to textual criticism, the individual transmissions of Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke also agree with having not a young man in the tomb, as in Mark, but either one angel, or that is in Matthew, or multiple angels, as in Luke, at the tomb. And that seems to be Luke's indebtedness to Matthew. Also, only in Matthew and Luke Acts do we find Jesus after his death commissioning the 11 to a mission after his death. Yeah, but again, Jacob, I could add many other parallels between the two documents that are similar. But at some point, maybe now, we'll talk about Papias, because Luke knows that Papias is a 5-volume exposition of logia about the Lord. And Papias was consumed with Matthew. So there we go. I'm going to be reading from the beginning, or the preface to the exposition of Papias on the left-hand side, and you'll be able to read on the right-hand side the parallels in Luke. The name of the author was Papias.
The name of the author was Luke.
And probably as a pseudonym, but it could be that the gospel did not have a name attached to it. I have made arguments, and others have too, that there was the pseudonym Luke. The name of the recipient is unknown.
The name of the recipient, Theophilus.
Papias says, I will not hesitate to set in order also for you the logia that he inherited from the Gospel of Mark and 2 Gospels of Matthew. He also may have known one or more books of expositions, diegesis, of Jesus's logo by the elder Aristion.
Since many have attempted to set in order an exposition of the matters that were fulfilled among us.
And I'll just have your viewers note that the syntaxito in Papias is picked up with the anatoxisty in Luke, and also we have the word diegesis in both cases. Let's do the next slide. Peter and Matthew were first-hand observers, while Mark and Matthew were translators and assistants.
As those who became from the beginning first-hand observers and assistants of the word.
According to Eusebius, the elders handed on traditions, paradises.
Handed on to us their exposition.
Papias learned about the teachings of the disciples by inquiring of anyone who had followed the elders.
It seemed good to me too, having followed them all thoroughly.
And notice in the parentheses, the par ekalokthekos and par kalokthekoti, the same unusual word is used in both of them. I will not hesitate to set in order also for you.
To write an exposition precisely in sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus.
Papias wanted to confirm the reliability of information that he had gathered from those who taught the truth.
So that you may recognize the certainty of logoi, about which you have been instructed.
Now, people have said, okay, this is simply a characteristic of the way people wrote prefaces in the scientific journals or the scientific treatises or in histories. And it simply is not the case. You cannot find a preface that is so similar with this vocabulary altogether anywhere else. And of course, they're talking about the same problem. That is multiple gospels. In Papias, the multiple gospels are 3, 2 Greek gospels of Matthew and 1 of Mark. And the 2 Greek gospels of Matthew likely are the lost gospel, Q, and Matthew. But we have another, actually more fascinating but contested example. And here, let's go to the next slide. The famous story about the death of Judas in Matthew is that out of remorse, he went and hanged himself. But before doing so, he tried to buy his way out by returning and assuage his guilt by returning the silver to the chief priests. They used it to buy a potter's field because they knew it was blood money. Papias knows that story and knows of people also who objected to that story. And so instead of having Judas kill himself, God punishes him. So here we're just going to start with Matthew and Papias. Now we'll go to the next slide, Jacob, and then we'll return to this slide and see what happens in Acts. The chief priests refused to accept the blood money, but used it instead to buy the potter's field for the burial of foreigners.
They say that after many tortures and punishments, he died in his own plot.
Judas went off and hanged himself.
Bloody discharge and maggots poured from all over his body. Such was the flux that seeped from his flesh to the ground.
Thus that field is called a field of blood. Okay, next page. What was said by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the purchase price set by some of the people of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field,
which became deserted and uninhabited
to this very day.
Even to this day, due to its stench, still today, no one can pass by that place without pinching his nostrils.
Judas's suicide was sufficient to reinstall him on a throne of judgment as promised in Matthew 19:28.
Papias later narrated how a certain Justice Barsabbas survived martyrdom by poison.
Okay, so those don't seem to be very parallel. And and here's the reason why. Let's go back up one slide. Now I'm going to read the exposition. Actually, I'll have you read it, and I'll read the Acts of the Apostles. So begin with "They say that after."
They say that after many tortures and punishments, he died in his own plot.
In Acts 1, this one purchased a plot from the reward of his injustice. And so it's not the high priests who buy the plot, but the Judas himself buys the plot with the proceeds that he received from the high priests. Bloody discharge.
Bloody discharge and maggots poured from all over his body. Such was the efflux that seeped from his flesh to the ground.
Falling face down, burst in the middle, and all his guts poured out. And it became known to all the residents of Jerusalem, so that plot was called, in their own dialect, Halkadamish, that is a plot of blood. And their Luke Acts is clearly using Matthew, right? You see those parallels?
Yes.
He's getting that not from Papias, he's getting it from Matthew. Luke knows Matthew. Let's do another page. Go ahead. Which became
deserted and uninhabited.
For it was written in the book of the Psalms, let his farm become deserted, let there be no inhabitant in it, and let another receive his responsibility.
Even to this day, due to its stench, still today, no one can pass by that place without pinching his nostrils.
Okay,
later,
that comes from Matthew, as we've seen. Okay, later, yep.
Later, Papias narrated how a certain Justice Barsabbas survived martyrdom by poison.
A lottery replaces Judas with Matthias instead of Joseph Barsabbas, Justice. So Luke knows both the Matthew story and the Papias story, and he likes Papias better because, in his view, what Judas did in Mark was so reprehensible that there was no eternal redemption for him, and only a miserable death and punishment. So those are the major arguments that I would use for Luke's knowledge of Matthew. So maybe I can see your face again and we can talk about it.
We have a couple of more slides, and then after that, I'll turn the presentation off.
No, let me see what they are. Just a minute. Oh, yes, this is a fascinating one. Yeah, let's do this. This is the parable of the prodigal son. It has a parallel in Matthew, which I think both of them are dependent on the logoi of Jesus here, but we're just talking about parallels between Matthew. And Matthew has a very simple, short parable that a man had two sons. He went to the first son and said, go to work. And he said, no, I don't want to. But later he changes his mind. The other son said, okay, Dad, I'll go out to work. And he doesn't go out to work. So the author then, Jesus, according to Matthew, says, which one did the will of his father? Not the one he said he didn't want to go, but the one who did. Now, this, in my view, is the background to the prodigal son story, which retells the story really of Odysseus, who leaves home. He's gone for a long time. He sleeps around with beautiful women before he gets home. He comes back home, and he has a remarkably pathetic and wonderful reunion with his father. And so I'll read the left-hand story, the left hand, and you can read the right. A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." But he replied, "I don't want to."
And he said, A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, Father, give me the portion of property that falls to me.
Okay, here's the Greek. Anthropos ekin tekna theo. Anthropos eke theo tekna. They're almost exactly the same words. But later he changed his mind.
But he came to his senses and said,
And went off to work.
So he arose and went to his father.
The father likewise went to the other, who replied, "Sir, I'm on my way."
But his older son was in a field.
Next slide. But he never went out. Which of the 2 did the will of his father?
But he was furious and did not want to go in. And his father went out and called to him. And he retorted to his father and said,
Truly, I tell you that tax collectors and prostitutes will precede the Pharisees into the kingdom of God.
But when your son comes, the one who devoured your money with prostitutes, for him you slayed a fattened calf.
So here we have really, I think, a fascinating hybrid where you have Luke expanding the story of 2 sons to the story of Odysseus returning home after being away for so long. Is that the last slide we have?
Yes, I'm going to turn it off now.
Okay.
And we have a super... go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, you go ahead. It can wait.
Well, I think the evidence is pretty clear that Luke knows Matthew. Now, what does that do to the Q hypothesis? I think it damages the Q hypothesis. I don't think it destroys it. And I think so the FAR hypothesis, Mark Goodacre and others, are correct about being skeptical about the reconstruction by the advocates of the 2 document hypothesis as it is published, for example, in the critical edition of Q. But I think the FAR hypothesis is wrong that in thinking that there is no Q document, and that would be a different topic for us to talk about. How we can reconstruct a Q document if Luke knows Matthew. But I think the door should be closed on the issue of whether Luke knows Matthew. But of course, dogmatic advocates of the 2 document hypothesis are going to disagree.
We have a super chat question from Donnie Springer. Thank you for the super chat. Can you explain why we accept that Papias was correct about the sequencing of the Hebrew Matthew, but was not correct about language of composition?
Donnie, that's a good question. He did not know a Hebrew Matthew. He was doing source criticism at a very early stage, and he imagined that there must be a Hebrew Matthew. And it could be that the elder John, from whom Papias gets his information, already is the source of that speculation. What he had is 2 gospels that were not Mark, that were similar to each other, that had Hebraic or Semitic influence. And he imagined that Matthew would have gotten it right in the right sequence. So he was concocting the notion of a Hebrew gospel. There never was a Hebrew gospel of Matthew. And so he was just, he and the elder John were winging it, trying to explain why you have these 2 Greek gospels of Matthew that differ from each other. And he considered them both to be flawed. And that's why he has the permission to come up with a different interpretation of the death of Judas.
Got another super chat. The Muslim apologist, thank you for your super chat. Was Luke trying to prop up his gospel as the only gospel to replace other gospels?
Yes, I think he probably was. So he says that their sequences are flawed and that he's going to do it properly so that the reader will have confidence in the authority of what he's going to be presenting. So I don't think it's overly generous to his antecedents. I think he's trying to trump them. Sorry for the word. But anyway, he's trying to improve them.
So you think that what's happening often in Luke's gospel is you're seeing evidence of it combining material that we see in Papias with Matthew. He's being a conflator here, taking material that he likes from Papias, taking material he likes from Matthew, and sometimes they mix up together.
Yes, but of course, the big tragedy is we have so little of Papias to go on. We do know that in the Acts of the Apostles and Papias, we have the earliest, in some cases, the only references to this Judas Barsabbas or Barsabbas Judas. The only references we have at an early time of the daughters of Philip. Both Papias and Acts talk about the execution of James, Jesus's brother. So we have a number of echoes between the two, and the direction of dependence almost certainly is Luke knowing Papias, although some people have challenged that notion. So I think that Papias belongs in the synoptic tradition, but also has affinities to the Johannine gospel. He, in fact, is citing the traditions from John the Elder, and there's nothing in his document that is Pauline whatsoever, even though he was the bishop of a church in the Pauline region of Western Asia Minor.
JC, thank you for the super chat. What if any Papias text exists when written? If not, what are the sources? Could Papias have written a Q version? Thank you. Your work is fascinating.
Well, there's a wonderful new edition of Papias's exposition that is by Stephen Carlson. And I actually haven't gotten my copy of it yet, so I'd have to check it. But he's a friend of mine, I guess, and we've talked about it. He's more interested in the reception of Papias, whereas I'm interested in Papias as a witness to what goes on earlier in the composition of the Gospels. He revisits the Armenian, the Latin, and the Greek sources for Papias, and then tries to catalog them according to a taxonomy of reliability. Which ones are most reliable and which ones aren't? How are people using Papias, and so on? No, Papias couldn't have written a Q version. He would not have treated his own as a defective variation on Matthew. So what are the sources for Papias? Well, most of the most reliable ones are probably in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. We have them also in Irenaeus, Apollinaris of Laodicea, which is the one that I read from for the death of Judas. We have a number of Armenian sermons that refer to Papias. Most of those now are considered to be speculative and not useful. But it's JC. It's a big question. It's a great question. But Papias knows Q, but he didn't write it. And we are still in the process of assessing the reliability of the Papias fragments. I would love to find someone who can verify what Papias wrote. By the way, copies in Greek were still available in the 4th century. So it's a real pity that by the way, the reason it failed to survive may be related to his concerns about Q. By the time these texts were failing, the Q no longer existed. And so his project of rewriting the Gospels and adding to them, interpreting them by using a document that no longer existed, really made people like Eusebius questioning Papias's reliability.
Johnny Springer again, thank you for your super chat. Would you say that the claim by Papias of a Hebrew Matthew is just a way of saying he knows Jesus spoke Aramaic, which necessitates a translation?
Well, Donnie, I think that's part of it, that he knows that Jesus spoke Aramaic. But I think the bigger issue is when you posit that there is an earlier document that is written by an authority that is one of Jesus's disciples. And by the way, the name Matthew may have been chosen because he was the only disciple who had a previous occupation that required literacy. That is, he was a tax collector. And so of the 12, if you're going to have someone who's literate and can write a gospel, it would be Matthew. But if you say that author is right and gets things in the right order and remembers things accurately, then you can blame Greek translators for the corruptions, such as the statement about the story about the death of Judas. So I don't think it's primarily that Jesus spoke Aramaic. I think it's a way of explaining problems in the 2 Gospels of Matthew. He knows, because he doesn't think if there are problems in them, you can attribute them back to the apostle.
Why do you think that when we get Matthew, we have Judas simply committing suicide, but later when we get to Papias and then to Luke, suddenly the story changes and Judas is exploding in his own neighborhood? Why do you think that change occurred?
I think the answer is actually pretty simple. Matthew retains the Q saying where Jesus says, "You are the ones who faithfully followed me. And the Father will give you the kingdom. When I sit in my glory, you will each sit on a throne judging a tribe of Israel. You will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Now, Matthew includes that promise, and he also includes Mark's depiction of Judas as the betrayer. So how are you going to get Judas qualified to sit on one of those thrones? Well, he has to show great remorse. And there's no way to show greater remorse than killing yourself. And so he kills himself, and that should be good enough because in a way he becomes a martyr for the cause. And Matthew knows the Markan story that the thrones in glory are reserved for the martyrs, those who share Jesus's cup and are baptized with his baptism. So then for the author of our Matthew, his self-suicide qualifies as a martyrdom of sorts. He shows remorse, and therefore he can sit on the throne. Luke doesn't like that answer, of course. So he gets rid of Judas and replaces by a lottery. And by the way, the lottery is an imitation of a lottery that appears in Iliad 7.
Would it be fair to say that when you hear from people that think that Luke is often more primitive than Matthew, not the other way around when it comes to the Q material, and that is a concern that they have, for the claim that Luke knew Matthew. The alternating primitivity not only deals with that, with both of them knowing Q, but in terms of the reverse priority, sometimes Luke is earlier in his material, sometimes Matthew is earlier in their material. But would it also be fair to say that setting the Q material aside, the rest of the material in Luke, for the most part, is clearly expanding the passion material in Matthew?
Whoa, well, you're way ahead of most of your viewers, I think. The way that one can, I'm going to back up a little bit and answer your question. The way one can still reconstruct Q is to examine Matthew and Luke with attention to places where Luke is more primitive than Matthew. And you collect a database of that material, and many places actually Luke is more primitive than Mark. So that becomes a part of your database. Also, Luke has doublets in certain things called avoided or non-doublets, where you can see that Luke, by using two sources, has duplicated his material. So then you can get back to a more primitive document. But as far as we know, by using that, we have almost no example. In fact, I would say we have no example of Luke being more primitive than Matthew. So when it comes to the passion narrative, we don't have a Q document. Because if we can reconstruct Q by places where Luke is earlier than Matthew, and we can't find any of that in the material in the passion narrative, we have nothing to go on. So Q probably ended with the promise of thrones and anticipation of Jesus's death. So is that a sufficient answer to your question, or do you want to rephrase it?
Well, I wasn't asking if there was a common source for the passion narrative. I was basically asking you, would it be a fair characterization of your theory that Luke and Matthew's alternating Q material, or alternating sayings of Jesus, or alternating primitivities, because they're being influenced by Q, but when it comes to the passion material, Luke is building over Matthew?
Yes, that's yeah. That basically, I mean that one always has to have a caveat occasionally, but yes, basically that's right.
Do you think it's possible that there was an earlier Hebrew source that some of this Q material could have come from, that we just don't really have evidence for because it didn't survive?
No, I'm sure we don't.
Hmm.
But let me step back a little bit and say the Q document, the best we can understand it, was not written by a Christian, but by a Jew who liked Jesus. And that Jew lived in a bilingual environment. And the Q document has lots of Semitic loanwords that come into Greek that we take for granted. So Amen is one. Gehenna is another. I'm blanking on some of them. Some of them puns we have of names. Iscariot is a pun on an Aramaic name with the Greek preface. Dalmanutha is Aramaic, an Aramaic sounding name. So that we have, and not sounding name, but a meaningful name. It means at the harbor. So we have these bilingual indications in the Greek gospel of the Logo of Jesus that indicates that Jesus was too from a bilingual environment. But I don't think there was anything written in a Semitic language earlier than what we have in the Gospels.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dennis.
Okay. Well, thank you for your questions and interest. Thank you for your questions, friends.
Yes, thank you to those that super chatted today. I appreciate their support, and thanks again, Dennis, for coming on.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.